From our studios in Los Angeles and Tampa, this is Green Tagged Theme Park in 30. I'm Philip. I'm joined by my co-host Scott Swenson. During Green Tagged, we look at the top theme park news from each week and discuss why it matters to you. And this week, we are talking about takeaways from IAAPA's North American Summit, which just happened at the Disneyland Resort. And I was there.
And I was not.
So I'm going to explain what happened to Scott, and then you all by extension, and then Scott can give his take because he has so much experience.
Philip just called me old, but that's okay.
Okay.
Right.
I called you experienced.
Experience. It was much kinder. It's much kinder.
So, okay. I try and be kind.
I know.
So I only went to half of it. I'm sorry, y'all. I had like stuff.
Oh, so here we go. We have here Philip attended, and then we find out Philip attended half of it.
But the half I did attend, great.
And it's still 50% or 100% more than I attended. So there you go.
The day I attended day 2, and day 2 is all about the Disneyland Resort. So we heard from executives at Disney discussing the Disneyland Resort. The second best was the first one we're going to start, which is discussing Toontown, and it was given by the vice president of Disneyland Resort. She gave us a lot of insights on the Toontown redesign area, and this has been open for a while, and I thought it was one of the best refreshes they've done, but hearing about it really underscored so many of the things that Scott talks about all the time, but it's like, it was done in a way where even though Disneyland is my home park and I go every month and I see these things, but then you hear it explained and you're like, oh, they did this seamlessly in the way that even I didn't really notice. But now that she mentions it, I was like, oh my gosh. And I think that's what we all want. We want to be able to redesign spaces in a way that just feels better. And, you can't really sit there and be, oh, it's because this shrub has moved 6 inches to the left, but it just feels better and it feels seamless. And I think that's what they did. But some of the things she talked about, the number one thing they talked about was creature comforts and accessibility, and how little things that I didn't really realize until she talked about them, but they took out all the curves because people trip on curves or just issues. They also created a dedicated parking zone for strollers, and they encourage all of the families to park their strollers like outside of the zone before they walk into the zone, and they put cast members there watching them. And I was like, we're basically designing like a mini city. And so what you're doing is, in order to make the city walkable, you have to have a parking structure. And if you think of strollers like cars, you're designing a parking structure with an attendant to park the strollers so that families can actually just walk around. And she stressed that she's like, you need to do these things. She talked about tables and chairs. She's like, they're so, so important just to have a place to sit down. And she explained the reasoning behind it, which is like something that I've never heard really anybody talk about in so blatantly. But she's like, look, the thing is, tables and chairs are important because it makes the ride experience better. And you're like, what? It's not a ride, it's a table. And she's like, but listen, she explained how when there is a table and chair and plenty of shaded space, that means that families that are hot and tired can rest and recharge so they feel refreshed before they stand in a line for 50 minutes with their screaming children. So she's like, the thing is, you have to reset people and let them have time to be able to sit down in a nice place. She's like, you don't want them eating their lunch on top of a trash can because that's such a bad experience, and they haven't sat down. And she's like, all these things are important. So they added more seating, they expanded those areas, reduced the curves, moved the stroller parking. And then she talked about the need to have downtime, which is something that Scott talks about all the time. But more like, she talked about how you can't just give it lip service. Like, you need to actually put in noise padding in a way that doesn't break the land illusion, but that there are designed areas within Toontown that are specifically decompression zones, where they did create areas where you can decompress, which is very important. And they talked about adding extra sensibility training and upping the training of the cast in that area to deal with people that might have a sensitivity issue, and be able to guide them to those areas and help them in that process. And I was like, this is all exactly what we talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you've got somebody who has boots on the ground experience, who
Yep.
actually is in the park on a regular basis, or at least whose people are in the park on a regular basis, although it sounds like she's there too. But you recognize that the line between creativity and operations is very blurry. And the
Hmm.
more blurry, the better, quite honestly, because you can be, you have to make sure that you remain in the world that you're creating creatively.
Yep.
However, that world needs to be a comfortable one. That world needs to be one that people want to be in, not just because of the IP, but because of the actual physical experience. So, it's one of those things that you have to design. You have to design for customer satisfaction.
Yep.
That's not just the training programs that you do with the human resources department. That is the way it is built, the way it is designed. And I will tell you, I know there are going to be people listening to me who are going to want to throw things at me when I say this, but anybody who has ever even thought about doing anything as far as theme park design, um, play Roller Coaster Tycoon for a while. Um, and I know that there are actually college courses that require it, but the thing about it is it's so well written in the fact the programming is so well written in the fact that if you don't have enough trash cans, if you don't have enough shade, if you don't
Yep.
have enough restrooms, if you don't have, or if you put your food locations too close to your rides, your high impact rides, then your guests, yes, this is part of the game, literally vomit. So it's really interesting in the way that it's been put together, and it requires you to be very, very creative in the way that you integrate these creature comforts and these basic amenities that you have to have, especially with a family, especially with a small with families with small children. And it was so funny because when I saw this in the in the notes, the first thing I thought was, well, here, at least here in Florida. Now, I don't know, I don't remember the one in California. I visited Toontown, but it's been several years now. But the one in Florida always felt like an afterthought.
Hmm.
It always felt like it was kind of tucked in there. It's like, oh, let's bring back the Mickey and the classic Disney characters, and always kind of felt like an afterthought. And I don't know whether that was true. Was that true in California too, Philip? Or was
Yeah,
it
and she did talk. She actually talked a little bit about the history, but yeah, I think they talked about how again maybe less of an afterthought and more of a like it's like, oh, we need a place where Mickey, and they kind of just like put like Mickey's. It was meant to be like you would walk into the Toontown area, but it wasn't designed. There's roads and curves, and it was really hot because it was so much like Toontown stuff is not like didn't have a lot of real trees. I mean, it was
right?
really it was more like they design. It was like what you were saying. Like it was almost like two-story first, where it was like you're walking into a Toontown. Well, like Toons don't need to go to the bathroom. They don't need shade. They don't.
Toons don't sweat. Yeah, Toons don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it was fascinating, and talking about the story, she talked about that in ways that what you're saying, but then apply it practically, which I didn't think about, but she talked about that they had this trend where they're moving from attraction based costumes to land based costumes. Because if you, and this is another thing, if I remember, and again, these are things where like you hear them and you're like, oh, this makes so much sense, but I didn't even notice. And that's their goal, because in the past, Disneyland was like, even when I worked at Disney, you had costumes based on the zone that you were in, as in like
Mhm.
the ride. This is your skipper outfit, or I was a cowboy. This is your cowboy outfit for the thing. You're okay. And now she's talking about how they have more just land costumes, and they're designing the costumes in a way where the cast members can make their own. So they've just designed like all sorts of elements. You have the tops, the bottoms, the accessories, all this kind of stuff. And the cast members can just mix and match. And they're not telling them you have to dress exactly like this. They're just giving them outfits that you would see people wear in Toontown, but they can choose, and that way they can make it their own. And she mentioned that's also important because, like they did with Star Wars, the Galaxy's Edge area, she's like, even regular cast members that are just in Toontown, they have to have a backstory, and they have to have like a North Star guiding the backstory, which is that they don't live in Toontown. They are there visiting. And why are you visiting Toontown? They need to be able to answer that, and then to be able to put together a costume on their own that matches that. And you're like, oh, these simple things, I mean, that doesn't take a lot of time, but the simple just alignment of like, you don't live here. Like, don't ever tell a cast member that you live here, because only Toons live here, because this is Toontown and you're a human. So you're a human visiting Toontown, and you've dressed up in this thing to visit Toontown. And why are you here? Tell us why you're here.
So it's interesting that you say this, and it's even translating into costuming, which
Yep.
is really cool, because again, in research that I'm doing for another project, I'm looking at customer service in various parks and various companies, and how they what their catchphrases or their mantras are. And Disney's currently is "Be you, be here, be part of the story." And what
Mm,
you've just explained so embodies and practically implements that whole concept. You know, be you, giving the team member or the cast member the opportunity
yep.
to create their own costume based on the parts and pieces. Be here, you are in Toontown, and be part of the story. But you're not a Toon, you're visiting, and we need to know why. So all of that is so in line with that very simple mantra that when you read it or hear it, it sounds kind of, vague and silly. But when you actually drill down a little bit more and see how it's being implemented, it's pretty impressive that they were able to create something that was so actionable.
Yep.
That's cool.
And see, that's exactly what I like about the IAAPA sessions, or this is what I think the industry sessions should be like. Because I'm an examples person, and I need both. I need, like, you need to tell me the theory, the North Star, but I need you to give me an example to really make it make sense for me. And I think this is exactly what I would want from an industry session, which is, here's the example. Okay, so here's the thing. Great, that's great, but it's not just lip service. This is how it's actually implemented, and we weren't allowed, obviously, to record anything or take pictures because it was a proprietary talk, but we got to see pictures of the different costume elements and the racks, and how the process works of letting them choose what they want. And I think that's important too, because you have to explain to the operators, this is how you can do it. And then maybe they're not going to do it on the scale of Disney, but it allows the operators to come up to think, okay, how could I implement this? How could I ask these simple questions? How could
Hmm.
I make sure that every cast member is aligned in, like you said, be here? Where are they? Why are they in this safari zone? What are they doing?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just love it when, because I'm the same way, and that's the way I always like to teach sessions
Yep.
too. I like to give theory. I like to do the what, the why, and the how. Those are the three things that I always want to get into a session whenever I teach it. And it's the what are we doing, why are we doing it, but like what is the theory, and the how are we implementing this. And when they align so perfectly, and Disney in the past, they kind of got a little rocky there for a while, but in the past they were the ones who pretty much set up the here's how we here's what we say, and here's how we make that real. um
Yep.
I think they went through a phase where they had to kind of reverse engineer it for a while, where they actually did the here's what we're going to do, and then had to figure out what the theory was as to why they were doing it, which is backwards and doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But this is a perfect example of how that sounds. It sounds like they're back on track, which is great.
And the next thing that I thought was just really funny, just because, speaking of the operator and that kind of figuring it out type of a thing, working backwards, and sometimes you have to work backwards, I think. So they talked about the interactive play areas, and it's one of those things where, I mean, it's just funny where you're like, they're making interactive play areas, and they're like, well, we didn't know how the grass was going to go because, oh, it's grass. And it's funny because operators understand that hesitancy, right? Where you're like, you want everything to be flat and to be durable. But when you think about the way children play, that's really not how children play. It's with flat, durable things. And she talked about those kind of things multiple times, where she's like, some of the most entertaining moments are just like the basic cardboard, or the basic boxes, not cardboard, but the
Hmm.
basic boxes we have
Well,
here.
yeah,
And
but it's the running joke of every parent at on Christmas morning, that whatever the largest present was the thing that the kids play with the most is the box that it came in. So.
yep. Yep. And she did talk about some logistical things where, that they're like, some of the play structures they got, were they got regular play structures which were not intended for the volume that they do. So they're having to kind of work with that and think about how to fix that. And then she, just funny things about how a lot of the operators in the room, they asked like, well, aren't you concerned about liability by putting these play structures in the area? And it's just funny that that's what operators think about, right? We always are like, what about the liability? And we, can't possibly have, a play structure, because what if they fall off it, whatever. And she didn't say this. She said that, there wasn't an increase in any, there's been no increase. But afterwards, I was talking with people, and I just think we just thought it was funny that, of course, our first reaction to wanting to put a play area, in a park is, what if they hurt themselves? And then you're like, we forget that, like, children know how to play. It's adults that have forgotten how to play.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and yeah, I without sounding once again like the old guy, um, I can remember when all playgrounds were blacktop and they didn't have, they went from blacktop to mulch to that foam padding stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and you know what? There's an entire generation, there's multiple generations that fell off of swing sets onto blacktop, and we
Yep.
survived.
Yep.
It's fine. Yeah. But again, I think that all too often, that's why I like to say blurring the line between operations and creativity, because all too often, the creative side is what can we do and here's why we should do it. And the operational side is, well, here's what we can't do.
Yep.
And there is a balance. I agree. You can't be completely, 30,000 feet all the time. You can't be blue sky all the time. But at the same time, it's not it should come back to the creative, and it should not the answer should not be, well, we can't do that. The answer is, if we do that or when we do that, here's what we have to make sure we've thought about.
Yep.
Because all too often operators will say, well, what about liability? And they're just waiting for someone to say, yes, that's right, it's too dangerous, we won't do it.
Yep.
So my favorite quote from one of my operator friends back at Busch Gardens, he was the head of head of our safety department, and he said, well, the safest way to run a park is never open it. So you'll never have a single injury. You'll never have a single guest complaint. You also won't make a dime. So
Yep. Yep.
it's always weighing being realistic and weighing the reality and the fantasy that you're trying to create and make it a fun place. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. It's got to be a fun place.
Yes. Well, okay. So we you just said something that was the last point, I thought, which she captured beautifully. She was a fan. I could listen to her all day, but she talked about that balance, of the items, and basically she was was talking about how, at this point, we all know, or we all should know, that you can make more money on food if it's more themed, right? So you plus up your food, you make it part of the experience, you can make more money on it. Food and drink, merchandise, that's all true. But she talked about the balance of, like, look, this is an area for families, and you have young families that need something affordable. And so
Affordable
she's
and
like,
not have chicken fingers. That's it.
yeah, exactly. And so she's like, you have this tension, basically, which exists where, like, you people want to make money on F&B, but also this is an area specifically for, like, the young market affordability, and that's important. And so she talked about making a good, better, best approach to the food and beverage in Toontown specifically, which is like, okay, there's the good option, which is for just affordability. Like you said, the chicken fingers, the basic things, and then there's plus, and then there's plus plus. And so that allows it where if you just get something for your kids, fine. And if the people who don't have kids, or someone who wants to spend more on F&B, there's that higher option for them where they make a better margin that is more themed. But there has to be an affordable option for the families just to have food.
And if
And
the affordable option is
and
not there, it means they make zero sales. So they make even
yep,
less.
yep,
Uh, so they might as well capture what they can and make certain, again, that the overall guest experience is a positive one. That's
yep.
the ultimate goal.
Yep, exactly. So I want to move on. The only other thing I thought was interesting is that she talked about, like you said, about the layout a little bit, where the merch shop, it's a classic Disney trope where the merch shop is the exit of the ride. But she talked about how that in many ways is almost a detriment for this one, because if the ride goes down, then that means that while it's down, you lose merch sales. And also that, Runway Railway is 1,600 an hour, and just the outflow of that almost is too much for the store, because the store isn't that big, and so it can get cramped in that area. And also, it being there means, it's kind of hidden because it's the exit to the ride, so it's kind of it's kind of distracted. So that was her interesting takeaways too, of just thinking about, yes, you are forcing people to walk through it so they can, get foot traffic. But if the space isn't big enough for the foot traffic, or if the exit is in a hidden place because it's an exit, and it's hidden by design naturally, then if the ride goes down, then you're losing that foot traffic entirely, and no one is going to the store.
It's interesting because that's one of the things that they did pretty well, just from my experience in looking at Warner Brothers World, on
Hmm.
House Island. One of the things they did well there is you still exit through the gift shop. However, the gift shop has two other entry points. So it makes it so that if you have a large exit flow all coming out at the same time, you've got plenty of room. They don't have to cram through one single exit point, number one. And number two, you have an entrance and an exit even if the ride's not working.
Yep.
So even for those people who aren't going on, Batman, you're still able to go into the shop and buy all the cool stuff. So it's once again, it's that balance of practicality and guest experience and fantasy. It's all got to
Yeah.
come together.
Okay. The next talk was a deep dive into Tiana's Bayou Adventure. I did not find this talk particularly useful just because I think that most of what it was just recapping information that you would already know if watch the doc, you watch the information that Disney, like it was basically was kind of like more of a press talk. So I don't really want to talk about it too much. The only things I thought were interesting is they talked about their North Star, which was one, a celebration of Tiana, two, authentically New Orleans, and three, a fun and joyful for everyone. That's also pretty like generic though. I think they said some things that are interesting. I'm just not sure how realistic they are for everybody in the room. I mean they talked extensively about the deep dive research that they did in New Orleans. So they had like a research team. They went there. She talked about how you can never go wrong telling the story when you go to the place, and they spent time with the families. I mean, they spent a lot of time with a family in a restaurant. They were trying to capture the vibe of that restaurant, interviewing all these people, going on site, I mean, they really, the Imagineers really spent the time doing that deep dive research. I'm not sure really. I mean, this is one of the things where I was like, well, this is like, I don't know of many other attractions besides Disney Universal that have the budget to employ an entire research team and
Well,
send them not to
and
spend X amount of months doing on location reporting.
and Walt himself was notorious for this. He would send animators to the Middle East to draw camels for 2 months. So
Yep.
it was one of those situations where research is important, and finding a way to immerse yourself in that and understanding it not just from what you see but also from what you hear, from what you smell, from the story, that's all really important. But it can be done on multiple different levels. You don't have to go and live in New Orleans for 3 months in order to understand what New Orleans is all about.
Yep.
You do a quick shot to New Orleans, you do a bunch of research. I mean, there's pretty much every major metropolitan area. If you want to learn about the food from any place in the world, you can probably do it in your own city. So, I think that it is important to do the kind of research. I'm not certain that it's absolutely essential that you have to be so immersed in the culture, especially if your budget can't afford it. So
And
don't ignore the concept, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess is my point. Just because you are on a more controlled budget, don't say, well, we just don't have the budget for research. You have the budget for research, but it just has to be focused, right sized to your budgetary restrictions. That's the important thing there.
I like exactly what you said. I think I would have preferred a talk that focused on what you said instead of like this is what we did, because it felt very like, look at how great we are, Disney PR type of a
Well, and
thing. And
anytime
I'm like,
anytime you've got a presenter that focuses on here's what we did, and especially
exactly.
if they are from Disney, I'm sorry, I'm going to call people out. If they're from, and I don't normally do this, if they're from Disney, Universal, or Meow Wolf, they will always focus on here's what we did, and everybody's sitting there. Three-quarters of the people sitting there are either going, well, one quarter is going, oh, that's the coolest thing. I wish we could do that, and the other three-quarters are
Mhm.
going, that's lovely, but that doesn't help us at all.
Exactly, exactly. So I think what you said was more my takeaways. I'm like, yes, we get it. Research is important, but how do we do that ourselves? And it is important to do it. How do we scale it? Um, and the next talk was about the downtown Disney transformation. What I thought was interesting, they talked about how they were going for a mid-century motif and open gathering spaces. We've heard a lot of this before because what they did is they kind of did made it like a gathering space in the middle of new restaurants and whatnot. So we've heard, again, this is another one where you've heard most of this before
It's a
because
verbal press
everyone's
release.
yeah, everyone's been talking about it. What I thought was hilarious was almost very similar to what they talked about with Toontown, where basically the head architect was like talking about how he's like, we wanted it to be like rolling hills, not like a flat hill. So basically his biggest challenge was just getting people to agree to let them make the grassy area like not flat, and that was like the biggest challenge of the entire project. And it was because, again, back to the thing where it's like people are like, if it's not flat, everyone's going to trip and fall, and there's going to be lawsuits, and this is a whole mess. And so he like finally convinced them to do it. And what happens? Oh, everyone loves it because they just sit on the grass. And it's one of those things where you're like, kids actually know how to play like on grass.
And
They're
grown-ups know how to sit on it. Grown-ups know how to sit on grass,
yeah, exactly.
especially in California with the weather there. It's go to any beach, go to any recreational area, and you will find people sitting on rolling hills. It's yeah.
Yep. Yep.
We
Yep.
can't overthink or over litigate things.
Yeah, I mean, you get the tendency, but I thought that was to me the biggest takeaway, which is like, sometimes if you are trying to create this environment, I mean, people have done this forever. Like, look at all the parks people go to. I mean, look at all the green spaces, and so you're just kind of like, okay, well, if they can operate in those parks, fine. Maybe there's a way for them to do also operate in this area where we just make this one area a little bit of rolling hills and it's going to be okay. And they also talked about how this was the first time they've made common seating areas in downtown Disney, where I guess in the past, because of, unions and blah, 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 like all this nonsense, basically like each restaurant has had seating area for that restaurant that was like in charge of that restaurant. But that's like very inefficient. It's like wildly inefficient. And so that was the second big push was like, what if we had an area that was like just common? And these things are just funny to me because they're so true, because every operator has faced the same problem. But then if
Mhm.
you think about it, every time you're in an airport or anywhere, there's so many places that have food courts that have common areas,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's
but
funny
it is a
because
problem.
it's almost like they started listening to the YouTube Disney hacks, which would say this restaurant is always really busy at lunch. However, go across the pathway to the palace, which is only open for breakfast and character dines, and their patio is completely empty. So just go over and sit there. Well, no, they've just made it so that they can the different restaurants when they're being used can be moved to different places. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Hey, you know what, Philip?
We're
We're
out of
out of time.
time.
I know we're out of time. That was great. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really cool. I feel like I was there,
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. We
and
didn't.
hopefully all of you guys do too when you're listening. That's one of those things. So yeah,
I didn't get to the one I thought was the most interesting, but we're just gonna have to do that in our Patreon.
yeah. We'll move on. We'll move that onto into Unhinged. Sorry guys, but hey, you can join us too. You can subscribe via Patreon and find us and green tagged Unhinged. It'll be fun, and hopefully we'll see some of you there. But if we don't, we'll see you next week right here on Green Tagged Theme Park in 30.